I sat at the table in our country house where time seemed to slow down. The white table was surrounded by the light of the desk lamp, and the entire room was filled with silence, except for the sound of John's keyboard keys. He was absorbed in yet another work presentation. I watched him, trying to provoke some kind of reaction, but instead I felt the distance between us growing. He was there, but his gaze was not directed at me. He was in another world, a world of numbers, graphs, and reports. Our conversations had become rare, as if we already knew that words would no longer resonate. He often stayed in his work world, absorbed in tasks that were always the priority. I had gotten used to it. It had become part of our routine. But in moments like this, I felt how our life was becoming more mechanical with each passing day, and something inside me began to protest. Only his phone, lying opposite me, reminded me of his presence. I couldn't help but notice how the screen glowed brightly, making me feel that here it was, his real life, and I was just a background detail. I tried to speak, but my words didn't grab his attention. He was still absorbed in his work, as always. I sighed, hardly noticing how much it was weighing on me. And at that moment, Ryan, John's best friend, suddenly turned to me. He was in town on business, and when his gaze met mine, a pause hung in the air. He smiled at me as if he had just returned from a long journey and said, "I don't understand how you manage everything. Despite your hectic schedule, you look amazing." I felt how his words, simple and sincere, hit the mark. It wasn't polite niceties or excessive kindness. He really admired me. Unlike John, his words didn't sound cold and automatic. Ryan seemed to see me for who I truly was, without any filters. I involuntarily felt important, as if at that moment he had given me something I hadn't received in a long time: attention. I didn't know what to do with this feeling. For a moment it seemed like there was something between us, but I quickly dismissed the thought. It was just the desire to be noticed, to be significant. But for some reason it was Ryan who became the person who unexpectedly brought a bright note into my life, something I had been missing for so long. When dinner was almost over, John, as expected, returned to his work. Without much word, he stood up, grabbed his phone, and headed to the next room, diving back into his tasks. I stayed at the table, trying not to show how much it upset me. We hadn't spent time together in ages, and despite John's physical presence, I felt him slipping away, becoming more and more unreachable. Instead of comforting me, the silence began to press down on me, and then, once again, Ryan was there. He wasn't in a hurry to leave, and he didn't hide his desire to talk. It was nice, though a bit strange. Why was it him showing such interest? Why not John? After all, John was my husband, and Ryan was just his friend. Ryan started the conversation about my work again. This time, he didn't ask about trivial matters or standard questions. He was genuinely interested in how I was handling my projects, what challenges I was facing, and how I was achieving success. His questions didn't seem cliché, they were filled with real curiosity. I felt a spark inside me. He was looking at me as a person whose accomplishments mattered. It was so unusual, so refreshing, especially after the past few months when I had felt more like a shadow in John's life than a partner. Ryan was, in a sense, the embodiment of something I hadn't felt in a long time: worth. He didn't see me as just the wife of a successful businessman as John did. He saw me as a separate individual with ambitions and desires. He admired my approach to design and said my work deserved more recognition. "You deserve much more than just being a wife," he once said. His words, spoken without any hint of flattery, felt like a revelation. It was something I had been searching for, but hadn't dared to ask for. In his eyes, I saw not just politeness, but genuine appreciation. And in that moment, I felt somehow lighter. His words, his attention, seemed to lift me, even if just for that brief moment. I felt the heavy burden start to ease a little. And despite trying to stay calm and composed, inside me, a turbulent mix of emotions still swirled. It was something new, something that gave me hope, though it was a little frightening. With every word Ryan spoke, I lost the sense that none of this mattered. because it meant more to me than I was ready to admit. Before dinner, John once again left for a call, disappearing into his room. I knew it wouldn't take long, that he would once again become absorbed in it, as always, leaving no attention for me. I stayed in the room alone, almost not feeling the weight of my situation, but still couldn't shake the strange sensation that something important was happening, that I was standing at a crossroads. Ryan stayed. He didn't leave, didn't offer to help John with anything, but simply remained sitting across from me, as if time didn't exist for him. I kept myself in check, trying to control my emotions, but gradually it became harder. His gaze grew more intense, and his words softer, almost intimate. It was strange, but I couldn't turn back anymore. We both felt the tension, as if the air in the room was filled with unbearable anticipation. When I accidentally touched his hand, I felt something spark between us. It was so quick that I didn't even understand what was happening. His hand, almost by itself, slightly reached out to me, and his gaze became more intense. I noticed how his breath deepened, and in his eyes, I could see that he could no longer hide what he was feeling. And I realized that I couldn't hide it either. The moment stretched on for an eternity. We both knew that this would be a turning point, that after this, nothing would be the same. I moved closer, not fully realizing what I was doing. And he, as if knowing I was ready, took my hand and pulled me toward him. That moment, his lips on mine, was both quick and painfully long. It wasn't like a kiss, it was like liberation. I didn't have time to think, didn't have time to regret, and there was no time to realize what exactly I was losing. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession, a moment when two people who had been hiding their feelings suddenly broke down all barriers and opened up to each other. I felt my life shattering into pieces at that moment. Everything I had tried so hard to ignore rushed to the surface. My head spun and my heart beat faster than I could ever imagine. This kiss wasn't just an act of passion, it was the result of emotions that had long been hidden, but never disappeared. As soon as he pulled away, everything returned to its place. Or rather, nothing returned. We both remained in silence, as if the world around us had frozen. I could have tried to justify myself or turn everything back, but it was already too late. This moment, this kiss, was a betrayal not only to John, but to myself as well. In his eyes, there was not only excitement, but also the realization that we couldn't return things to how they were. Both he and I knew that this kiss had changed everything. When I returned home, John was already in his room. He didn't even notice that I was a little different, or maybe he did, but didn't want to ask. We didn't exchange a single word, as if everything between us remained unchanged. But I knew. Everything had changed. My steps around the house became quieter, as if I was trying to convince myself that everything was still in its place. I took off my coat and hung it up, but the inner storm didn't subside. My mind was in chaos. Everything that had happened with Ryan came back to me in waves. His touch, his gaze, his kiss, which now stood between us, offering no peace. I tried to gather my thoughts, but I couldn't. Everything was mixed up in my head. John, the one with whom we had built this life, felt so distant, while Ryan had somehow become closer, even though his presence and closeness violated my own boundaries. I couldn't justify myself. I couldn't say exactly what it had been. A moment of weakness? A desire for attention? Or something more serious? And what now? I already knew I wouldn't be able to simply forget, as if nothing had happened. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of confusion. It was a real feeling that had seized me unexpectedly, and I wasn't ready to fight it. With each day, with every glance from Ryan, I felt myself being drawn to him, and every moment of his attention became a drug I couldn't refuse. When I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I felt an emptiness growing with every passing hour. My view of John, who was sleeping in the next room, became strange. He was still the same John with whom I had started this journey, but now it seemed like I didn't know anything about him. I tried to imagine what his face would look like if he knew what had happened between Ryan and me, and in that moment, I realized that I wouldn't be able to justify myself. I wouldn't be able to turn it all back. Inside me, two voices were fighting. One said I should stop, not let myself get any further lost in this story. The other said it didn't matter, because my feelings and desires had been suppressed for so long that now they had burst out like a river, destroying everything in its path. I felt lost, trapped in my own emotions, and didn't know how to get out of this trap. The time that passed after that kiss felt like an eternity. With each day, I sank deeper into this inner conflict, into the guilt and fear of what I might lose, and at the same time, I was drawn to Ryan, as if he were the only person who truly saw me. A few days later, as I tried to recover from my own chaos, Ryan appeared again. He called me, suggesting we meet, and I felt a strange mix of anxiety and desire wash over me. His presence had now become something inevitable, like oxygen that I couldn't help but breathe, even if it threatened to suffocate me. We met at a cafe, a small, cozy place where no one could notice us. His eyes, as always, searched for mine, and I couldn't avoid that gaze. We began talking, and he didn't mention a word about what had happened between us. His manner was so natural, so effortless. He spoke about his work, asked how my project was going, showed interest in my ideas. But in his voice, in his tone, I could feel that he remembered. He remembered how I had touched his hand, how our lips had met in that kiss. But he remained silent. It was as if it had never happened. I understood that this was all wrong. It was like playing with fire. I shouldn't have continued talking to him. I shouldn't have let myself lose control. But despite all my attempts to maintain distance, every word he spoke, every glance he gave me, drove the spear of temptation deeper into me. I felt my internal walls crumbling and I couldn't do anything to stop it. "You look tired," he suddenly said, looking at me with an attention I had been missing for so long. "I can see that work is taking a lot out of you." I nodded, but instead of answering, I once again felt how his words penetrated deep into my soul. I wanted to confess to him, tell him everything that was going on inside me, but I couldn't. I didn't know what would come of it if I started speaking the truth. I didn't know where it would lead us. He continued the conversation, lightly touching on work and hobbies, never returning to what had happened between us. But I could feel how that invisible connection between us was growing stronger. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything, and every time he looked at me, I lost the ability to think rationally. He was there, and in his presence, I forgot everything. I felt alive, significant, desired. But at the same time, I knew it would lead nowhere. Both Ryan and I were standing on the edge, and I couldn't allow myself to take another step. I couldn't allow myself to destroy whatever was left between me and John, even though so much had already been lost. But each time his gaze met mine, I lost control. I knew that with each step, with each conversation, I was sinking deeper into this story. And despite my attempts to stop, I couldn't do it. I knew I had to stop, but again and again, with every word, I allowed myself, to lose what seemed to be important. I was trapped between the past I didn't want to let go of and the present that was pulling me in like an unknown force. That evening, when I was once again alone in the house, the waiting became unbearable. John hadn't come back, and I felt how the space around me shrank, becoming heavy and empty at the same time. His absence, his silence were familiar to me, but now I felt like I couldn't ignore it any longer. Everything that had happened in my life over the past weeks seemed unbearable, and no matter how hard I tried to keep myself together, a feeling of despair wouldn't leave my soul. The phone call was unexpected. Ryan. His voice on the other side of the phone sounded a little tense, but still with that same attention that I knew so well. He said he wanted to talk. I didn't know what to do, but I felt that I couldn't refuse. I couldn't say no to him. And so here I was again, sitting in the dark living room when he arrived. When he entered the room, his presence, as always, filled the space. His gaze was firm, but in it I could see not only determination, but also a kind of unease. I noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he took off his jacket, and in that moment I realized He knew that we were both standing on the edge, and perhaps at that moment, he himself wasn't sure if it was worth it. We didn't start talking right away. At first, there was an awkward silence as we both sat across from each other, trying to find the right words. But Ryan's gaze, it didn't leave mine, and I realized that there was no longer any distance between us. Everything that had separated us disappeared. Our hands found each other almost without words, and in that moment, I realized that I couldn't stop anymore. My inner protest, all the reasons I had once told myself, were gone. I wanted this. I had been waiting for this. He had been waiting too. And when I closed my eyes to stop time, his lips found mine again. This kiss was different, not like the first time. It was passionate, burning, almost desperate. My head spun from the sensations I hadn't felt in a long time, and at the same time, deep in my soul, I felt how everything that had once been important to me was crumbling. My marriage, my home, my life, none of it was what I had once believed it to be. When we pulled away, I sat next to him, but couldn't look him in the eyes. I knew that this had become the final line that separated me from everything I had left behind. I couldn't go back. Everything I had once considered my world had disappeared in a single moment. I sat in this house, surrounded by silence, and all my feelings, my thoughts, were consumed by what had happened. I knew I wouldn't be able to explain to myself or to John what had taken place. This was more than just infidelity. This was the destruction of everything that had once been mine. A storm raged inside me. Everything I had once sought in John, all the moments of love and attachment I had tried to hold on to, now felt empty, lost. I was here, with Ryan, and I could no longer hide that I had already lost myself. The next morning, when I woke up, the house was strangely silent. John wasn't around, and for a moment I even felt a sense of relief. I was alone with myself again, in a world where everything was falling apart. Suddenly I heard the sound of a door opening, and I felt my heart skip a beat. It was him. John entered the room with an unfamiliar calmness. He looked at me as if he already knew I wasn't the same as I had been. He was silent, and I could feel how everything between us was becoming unbearably heavy. I couldn't remember the last time we had gone so long without speaking. He came closer, and without saying a word, placed my phone in front of me. My eyes immediately fell on the screen. He had opened the messages from Ryan. I felt the blood drain from my face, and every inch of my body became heavy, like stone. I couldn't move, couldn't find a single word of explanation. Everything inside me became clear and obvious to him. In his eyes, I could already see everything I had tried to hide: disappointment, pain, betrayal. "Have you lost your mind?" His voice was cold, and I couldn't bear that coldness. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" I tried to say something to justify myself, but the words caught in my throat. I knew there were no excuses for me now. I had made my choice, and that choice was already obvious to him. He looked at me again, but now in his eyes there was nothing but emptiness. "Everything you told me, it was all a lie. Did you think I wouldn't notice? That you could hide this from me?" I remained silent. I had nothing to say. At one point he turned away and, without saying another word, left. I was left sitting in the empty room, feeling as though the world I had once known had crumbled. I could feel my hands start to shake, and inside, everything was churning. He was gone, and I didn't know what to do next. I waited for him to come back. I hoped he would stop, at least to talk. But it didn't happen. He left, and I was alone. All those months, all those weeks I had spent trying to figure out what was wrong between us had led to this moment. I stood in the ruined house, surrounded by silence, and realized that I had lost not just John, but myself. Everything was destroyed, and there was no way back now. I felt a wave of guilt crashing over me. I tried to justify my actions, but I knew it was impossible. I had destroyed everything I had, and I couldn't understand what to do now. Several days passed, My whole life now seemed like a gray, dull shadow of what it used to be. I tried to return to the usual rhythm, but nothing worked. John was gone, and his absence left an emptiness that could not be filled. I sat in our house, looking at the photographs that once seemed important, and wondered what would become of my life now. Ryan disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. He didn't call, didn't come, didn't give any hint that our silence might lead to something more. At some point, I realized that he wasn't the one I had been looking for. He had become a moment, brief and intense, like a fire that burns out in a second. And now, with that fire extinguished, I was left alone, amid the ruins of my life. My attempts to justify myself, the justifications I had been seeking from him, now seemed ridiculous.